On the evening of December 23rd, 1975, at approximately 10:20 p.m., Richard Skeffington Welch, a 46-year-old career officer of the Central Intelligence Agency serving as the CIA's station chief in Athens, Greece, was shot 3 times in the chest as he stepped out of his chauffeured car in front of his residence in the affluent Psychiko neighborhood of Athens. His wife, Catherine, who had been seated beside him in the vehicle, watched as her husband collapsed onto the cobblestone driveway. The driver, a Greek national employed by the American Embassy, attempted to shield Welch's body while Catherine screamed for help. Neighbors would later report hearing the shots, sharp cracks that echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding villas, followed by the sound of a motorcycle engine accelerating away into the darkness. Richard Welch died before the ambulance arrived. The 3 bullets that killed him had been fired from a .45 caliber handgun at close range by members of a Greek Marxist terrorist organization called Revolutionary Organization 17 November, commonly known as 17N. The assassination was the group's first successful murder of an American official and would become one of the most politically consequential killings of the Cold War era, not because of what Welch had done as a CIA officer, but because of how his killers had found him. Before we continue with how a magazine article set in motion the events that would lead to this assassination, if you're interested in the documented stories of Cold War intelligence operations and their human cost, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these carefully researched cases every week. Now, let's examine how Richard Welch's name ended up in print and what happened when words became weapons. In its November 1975 issue, a publication called CounterSpy magazine had published Richard Welch's name and his position as CIA station chief in Athens. The magazine, produced by an organization called the Fifth Estate, dedicated itself to what its editors described as exposing the clandestine activities of the U.S. intelligence community. His home address at 20A Loukianos Street was already known. It had been published in Athens News English-language magazine The Athenian earlier that year, and the residence had been used by previous station chiefs, making it familiar to anyone monitoring American intelligence activities in Greece. What CounterSpy provided was confirmation and official identification in a publication that circulated among radical political groups across Europe and the United States. The information had appeared in a regular feature the magazine called Naming Names, which listed the identities and locations of alleged CIA officers operating under diplomatic cover around the world. The article about Welch had been brief, fewer than 200 words identifying him by name, stating that he was the CIA station chief in Athens, describing his cover position, and noting his previous assignment in Lima, Peru. Whether the terrorists who killed Richard Welch had used CounterSpy magazine, the Athens publication, or other sources would become a matter of intense debate. What was not debatable was that multiple publications had printed information that made him a target and had demonstrated that the CIA's ability to protect the identities of its officers operating abroad had been fundamentally compromised. Richard Skeffington Welch had been born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1929, the son of a physician. He had attended Harvard College, graduating in 1950 with a degree in classics. After briefly teaching Latin and Greek at a private preparatory school, he was recruited by the CIA in 1951. His career over the next 24 years took him to postings in Guatemala, Cyprus, Peru, and Libya, always operating under diplomatic cover, typically as a political officer or cultural attaché, while his actual work involved intelligence collection, liaison with foreign intelligence services, and management of human sources. By 1975, colleagues described him as a competent, careful officer who spoke fluent Greek and took operational security seriously. Colleagues who served with Welch in earlier postings and who were interviewed by CIA internal investigators after his death described him as methodical and professionally cautious, but not paranoid. One former colleague who had worked with Welch in Peru during the early 1970s told investigators that Welch had understood the risks of intelligence work, but had believed those risks came primarily from hostile foreign intelligence services conducting professional operations, not from American publications making his identity available to anyone with violent intentions and a motorcycle. The colleague said Welch had once remarked that the worst outcome he could imagine was being caught in a Cold War crossfire, killed not for anything he had done, but simply for being an American intelligence officer in the wrong place at the wrong time. In a sense, that was exactly what happened. Welch had been assigned to Athens in September 1975, replacing the previous station chief who had completed his tour. The assignment had come during a period of significant political instability in Greece. The military junta that had ruled the country since 1967 had collapsed in July 1974, following its disastrous involvement in a coup in Cyprus that had triggered a Turkish invasion of the island. Democracy had been restored, but the transition had been chaotic, and Greek society remained deeply polarized between right-wing elements, sympathetic to the former junta, and left-wing groups that viewed the United States as having supported the military dictatorship. The CIA station at Athens was considered an important posting during this period because Greece occupied a strategic position on NATO's southeastern flank, bordering the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in the Balkans and serving as a base for U.S. military operations in the eastern Mediterranean. The station chief's responsibilities included monitoring Soviet intelligence activities in Greece, maintaining liaison relationships with Greek intelligence services, and collecting information on political developments that might affect U.S. strategic interests in the region. When Welch arrived in Athens to assume his position, he moved into a residence at 28 Loukianos Street in Sikiko, an upscale neighborhood approximately 4 miles northeast of central Athens. The house was a 2-story villa with a walled garden, typical of the area's residential architecture. The residence had been used by previous station chiefs and was known to Greek authorities and to anyone with an interest in monitoring American intelligence activities in the country. The practice of station chiefs living in the same house, using similar cover positions, and following predictable patterns had created what security analysts would later describe as a systematic vulnerability that made surveillance and targeting easier for hostile actors. Welch's cover position in Athens was as first secretary in the embassy's political section, a title that appeared on the embassy's official roster and that provided him with diplomatic immunity under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. He maintained an office at the American Embassy on Vasilissis Sophia's Avenue, attended diplomatic functions, and engaged in the kinds of activities that would be expected of a mid-level political officer. His actual work, conducted through secure communications channels and involving meetings with intelligence sources, took place behind this facade of diplomatic routine. The terrorist organization that would eventually kill Richard Welch had been founded in December 1973, taking its name from the date, November 17th, when Greek police and military forces had violently suppressed a student uprising at Athens Polytechnic University during the final years of the military junta. The crackdown had resulted in dozens of deaths and had become a symbol of the junta's brutality. The organization 17N styled itself as a revolutionary Marxist group, seeking to punish those it viewed as responsible for supporting the dictatorship and for perpetuating American imperialism in Greece. 17N operated as a clandestine cell structure, with the members whose identities remained unknown to Greek authorities for more than 2 decades. The group communicated with the public through proclamations issued after each of its attacks, explaining its motivations and naming its targets. Its operational pattern typically involved careful surveillance of targets, assassinations carried out by small teams using firearms or explosives, and immediate disappearance back into anonymity. Prior to the killing of Richard Welch, the group had carried out several attacks on Greek targets associated with the former junta, but had not yet killed an American. The decision to target Welch represented an escalation and reflected the group's view of the CIA as a primary instrument of American intervention in Greek affairs. The editors of CounterSpy and the organization that published it, the Fifth Estate, operated from the conviction that the CIA's clandestine activities constituted a threat to democracy both abroad and at home, and that exposing these activities served the public interest. The magazine had been founded in 1973 by a collective of anti-war activists, journalists, and former intelligence officers who opposed U.S. foreign policy during the Vietnam War era and who viewed intelligence agencies as instruments of imperialism and oppression. The magazine's approach to naming names had evolved from earlier efforts by activists and journalists to document and publicize the identities of CIA officers. One of the most prominent figures in this movement was a former CIA officer named Philip Agee, who had resigned from the agency in 1969 and had subsequently dedicated himself to exposing CIA operations. Agee had published a book in 1975 titled Inside the Company, CIA Diary, which detailed his work for the CIA in Latin America and included names of officers and their local collaborators. Agee's work had provided a template for CounterSpy's Naming Names feature. The magazine's editors argued that CIA officers operating under diplomatic cover were violating the spirit of diplomatic conventions, that their activities often involved supporting authoritarian regimes and undermining democratic movements, and that the American public had a right to know about these activities. They maintained that exposing the identities of CIA officers would make it more difficult for the agency to conduct operations, and would thereby serve as a check on what they viewed as unaccountable and dangerous government power. The information CounterSpy used to identify CIA officers came from multiple sources: analysis of State Department and embassy rosters looking for patterns that suggested intelligence rather than genuine diplomatic work, tips provided by sources within foreign governments or political movements, observation of American officials' activities in various countries, and information from former CIA officers like Agee, who provided details based on their knowledge of the agency's organizational structures and personnel. The article identifying Richard Welch had appeared in CounterSpy's November 1975 issue alongside similar identifications of alleged CIA officers in other countries. The article's text had been matter-of-fact, presenting the information as straightforward reporting without inflammatory commentary. The magazine had printed this information and distributed it through normal channels to its subscribers. The editors had no reason to believe that this particular identification would have consequences different from the dozens of other names they had published over the previous 2 years. For Richard Welch, however, the consequences would be fatal. The autumn of 1975 in Greece had been politically tense. The country was still adjusting to the restoration of democracy, and debates over responsibility for the dictatorship years, over the Cyprus debacle, and over Greece's relationship with the United States and NATO had created a polarized and sometimes volatile public discourse. Anti-American sentiment, which had existed in certain segments of Greek society even before the junta, had intensified as details emerged about American support for the military regime. 17N had been monitoring American officials in Athens as potential targets. According to later analysis of the group's patterns and proclamations, they had been seeking to identify high-value targets whose assassinations would deliver both symbolic and practical blows to American interests in Greece. The CIA station chief represented exactly such a target, a senior intelligence official responsible for operations that the group viewed as hostile to Greek sovereignty and democracy. On the evening of December 23, 1955, Richard and Catherine Welch had attended a Christmas party at the residence of the American ambassador to Greece, Jack Kubish. The party had been a diplomatic function attended by embassy staff, American business people working in Greece, and some Greek officials. According to later accounts from attendees, the atmosphere had been festive but subdued, reflecting both the Christmas season and the general unease that pervaded Athens during this period. The Welches had left the ambassador's residence at approximately 10 p.m. They were driven by their regular driver in a dark-colored sedan that belonged to the embassy motor pool. The route from the ambassador's residence to their home in Psychiko took approximately 20 minutes at that time of night, traveling through neighborhoods that were quiet and residential. At approximately 10:20 p.m., the vehicle turned onto Lukianu Street and pulled into the driveway at number 20A. This routine, returning home late in the evening from diplomatic functions, was something the Welches had done dozens of times during the 4 months they had lived in Athens. The procedure was for the driver to pull into the driveway, which was protected by a wall and gate, and for Richard to exit first, followed by Catherine. On this evening, as Richard Welch opened the car door and stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway, 3 shots were fired in rapid succession. The shooters, later determined to have been waiting near the entrance on a motorcycle, had been positioned for precisely this moment. The .45 caliber bullets struck Welch in the chest, and he collapsed immediately. Catherine Welch, still seated in the vehicle, began screaming. The driver attempted to shield Welch's body while also trying to protect Catherine from potential additional gunfire. The motorcycle carrying the shooters, 17N later indicated in its proclamations that 2 men had been involved in the actual assassination, accelerated away down Luciano Street. Neighbors who heard the shots and Catherine's screams called the police and an ambulance. Greek police officers arrived within approximately 10 minutes. The ambulance arrived shortly thereafter. Welch was pronounced dead at the scene. The Greek police investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately unsuccessful in identifying the killers. 17N's operational security was sophisticated, and the organization had established protocols that made it extremely difficult for authorities to penetrate. No witnesses had seen the shooters' faces clearly enough to provide useful descriptions. No physical evidence at the scene led to identifiable suspects. The .45 caliber weapon used in the killing was never recovered. Approximately 2 weeks after the assassination, a Greek-language newspaper received an envelope containing a typewritten proclamation from 17N claiming responsibility for the killing. The document, which was several pages long, explained that the organization had targeted Welch because he was the chief of the American CIA in Greece, and because the CIA represented American imperialism and intervention in the internal affairs of the Greek people. The proclamation made no reference to CounterSpy magazine or to any specific source of information about Welch's identity and location. However, it demonstrated detailed knowledge of Welch's role and position, referring to him by name and title, and explaining why 17N considered him a legitimate target for revolutionary violence. The response in the United States to Welch's assassination was immediate and intense. The killing was front-page news in major newspapers and the lead story on television newscasts. President Gerald Ford issued a statement condemning the murder and praising Welch's service to the country. The CIA, which normally did not publicly acknowledge the deaths of officers killed in operational circumstances, made an exception in Welch's case, with Director William Colby confirming Welch's CIA employment and describing him as a dedicated public servant. Welch's body was returned to the United States on a military transport aircraft. On January 6, 1976, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in a ceremony attended by hundreds of CIA officers, government officials, and members of Welch's family. President Ford attended the funeral, the first time a sitting president had attended the burial of a CIA officer killed in the line of duty. The ceremony included full military honors, with Welch posthumously awarded the Intelligence Star, the CIA's second highest decoration. Catherine Welch, who had witnessed her husband's murder, returned to the United States with his body and subsequently withdrew from public life. Colleagues who knew the couple later described their marriage as close and their partnership as one in which Catherine had been aware of and supportive of Richard's work despite its dangers and demands. The trauma of watching her husband gunned down in front of their home was, by all accounts, devastating and would shape the remainder of her life. The Welches had no children. Richard's family, his siblings and extended relatives, were left to grapple with a death that had occurred in circumstances they could not fully discuss, and for reasons that involved classified activities they could not be briefed on. The public narrative of Welch's service described him in general terms as a diplomat and government servant. His actual work remained classified, and his family was left with incomplete understanding of what he had done and why it had made him a target. While Catherine retreated into private grief, Washington turned the assassination into a political flashpoint. In Washington, the political response to Welch's assassination focused rapidly on the question of how his identity had been compromised and what role the publication of his name in CounterSpy magazine had played in his death. Members of Congress, particularly those on committees overseeing intelligence activities, began calling for investigations and for legislation to prevent similar disclosures in the future. The Director of Central Intelligence, William Colby, testified before congressional committees in closed sessions during January and February of 1976, describing the damage caused by the exposure of CIA officers' identities and arguing that such exposures created unacceptable security risks. Colby did not definitively state that the CounterSpy article had directly caused Welch's death. The evidence for such a claim was circumstantial, but he made clear that the publication of such information created conditions that made CIA officers vulnerable to targeting by hostile actors. The editors of CounterSpy responded to the criticism by denying responsibility for Welch's death and by reiterating their position that exposing CIA activities served the public interest. In a statement published in the magazine's next issue, the editors argued that responsibility for Welch's death lay with the CIA and with U.S. foreign policy, not with those who exposed the agency's activities. They maintained that CIA operations in Greece and around the world created the conditions for violence and resistance, and that those who carried out these operations assumed risks that were consequences of the policies they implemented, not of the journalism that exposed them. This position satisfied few outside the magazine's core readership. Even many critics of the CIA and of U.S. foreign policy found it difficult to defend the publication of information that, whether directly or indirectly, had contributed to the targeting of an individual for assassination. The First Amendment protected CounterSpy's right to publish such information, but the question of whether exercising that right was morally or ethically justified became a matter of heated debate. Philip Agee, whose work had inspired and informed CounterSpy's Naming Names project, also defended the practice of exposing CIA identities, arguing in interviews and public statements that the CIA's activities caused far greater harm than any risk to individual officers. Agee maintained that CIA officers operating under diplomatic cover violated international law and diplomatic norms, and that revealing their identities was legitimate political activism. The debate played out in newspapers and congressional hearings throughout 1976 and 1977, with civil liberties organizations defending CounterSpy's First Amendment rights, while acknowledging the security concerns, and intelligence officials arguing that such disclosures endangered both individuals and operations. Within the CIA, Welch's assassination prompted a comprehensive review of security procedures for officers serving abroad under diplomatic cover. The review, conducted during the first half of 1976, identified numerous vulnerabilities in how the agency protected its officers' identities and in how officers themselves maintained operational security. Findings included that the practice of station chiefs living in residences that had been used by previous station chiefs created patterns that made identification easier, that certain cover positions within embassies had become so commonly associated with CIA roles that they provided little actual cover, and that officers' activities often made their actual roles obvious to anyone conducting even casual surveillance. The review recommended rotating station chief residences more frequently, creating more varied and credible cover positions, improving training for officers on maintaining cover in hostile environments, and enhancing physical security measures at residences and offices. Many of these recommendations were implemented over the following years, though institutional inertia and resource constraints meant that change came slowly. The broader question of how to prevent or deter the publication of CIA officers' identities by magazines and activists became the focus of legislative attention. Beginning in 1977, members of Congress began drafting legislation that would make it a federal crime to intentionally disclose the identity of covert intelligence officers. The legislative process consumed 6 years, from 1976 to 1982, as lawmakers struggled to craft a law that would protect intelligence officers without violating the First Amendment. Multiple drafts were written, debated, and revised. The central challenge was defining terms like covert officer and intentional disclosure in ways that would survive constitutional scrutiny while addressing the security concerns Welch's assassination had highlighted. The legislation that eventually became law, the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, was not passed until 1982, more than 6 years after Richard Welch's death. The final version created 3 categories of prohibited disclosures. First, it made it a crime for any person with authorized access to classified information to intentionally disclose information identifying a covert agent, knowing that such information was classified and that the United States was taking steps to conceal the agent's relationship with the intelligence agency. Second, it made it a crime for any person with authorized access to classified information concerning covert agents to intentionally disclose such information to someone not authorized to receive it, knowing that the disclosure would identify a covert agent. Third, and most controversially, it made it a crime for any person, in the course of a pattern of activities intended to identify and expose covert agents, to disclose information that identified a covert agent, knowing that such disclosure would impair U.S. foreign intelligence activities. This third provision was specifically designed to address publications like CounterSpy that made a practice of identifying CIA officers, but it included the requirement that the disclosure be part of a pattern of such activities, and that the person making the disclosure knew it would impair intelligence activities. These limitations were intended to protect journalists who might occasionally report on intelligence matters without engaging in a systematic campaign to expose covert identities. The law defined covert agent to mean an officer or employee of an intelligence agency whose relationship with that agency was classified, or a foreign national who was acting as an agent or informant for the United States, and whose relationship with U.S. intelligence was classified. The law required that the United States be taking affirmative steps to conceal the individual's intelligence relationship. Penalties included fines and imprisonment of up to 10 years for current or former government employees who disclosed covert identities, and up to 3 years for those without authorized access who engaged in patterns of exposure activities. The passage of the Intelligence Identities Protection Act in 1982 was hailed by intelligence officials as an important step in protecting officers serving abroad, but civil liberties advocates remained concerned that even the carefully crafted final version might have chilling effects on legitimate journalism and political speech. In the decades since its passage, the law has been invoked rarely, with only a handful of prosecutions and no successful prosecution of a journalist or activist for exposing covert identities. CounterSpy magazine ceased publication in 1984, approximately 2 years after the Intelligence Identities Protection Act became law. The magazine's circulation had declined, its funding sources had dried up, and the political environment of the early Reagan years was less receptive to its anti-intelligence message than the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate era in which it had been founded. The final issue included no acknowledgement that the magazine's activities had contributed to Richard Welch's death, maintaining instead the position that responsibility lay with U.S. foreign policy rather than with those who exposed its instruments. Philip Agee, who had inspired and supported the magazine's work, lived in Cuba and Europe during the 1980s and 1990s, his U.S. passport having been revoked by the State Department in 1979 on national security grounds. He continued to write and speak about intelligence issues, maintaining until his death in 2008 at the age of 72 that his work exposing CIA activities had been justified and necessary. He never expressed regret for his role in creating the environment that led to the exposure of officers like Richard Welch. Catherine Welch's life after December 23, 1975, became defined by absence and trauma. According to later accounts from CIA colleagues who maintained contact with her, she struggled with what psychologists would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares that replayed the sound of gunshots, an inability to feel safe in parking areas or driveways, and a profound sense of guilt that she had survived while sitting inches away from her husband when the bullet struck. She attended congressional hearings on the Intelligence Identities Protection Act in 1981, though she did not testify publicly. According to congressional staffers present during closed-door sessions, she told legislators that Richard had known the risks of intelligence work, but had believed the government would protect officers' identities, and that the publication of his name in CounterSpy had betrayed that expectation. She supported the legislation not out of vindictiveness toward the magazine's editors, but out of a desire that no other CIA spouse would watch their partner die on a driveway because someone had decided that exposing identities served a political purpose. Catherine lived quietly in the years that followed, maintaining connections with the CIA community through memorial events and occasional contact with former colleagues of her husband, but largely staying out of public view. She never remarried. Friends later said she kept a photograph of Richard on her mantle, not from his CIA work, which produced no photos she could display, but from their wedding day in the early 1960s, when neither of them could have imagined how their story would end. The woman who had witnessed her husband's assassination carried that memory for the rest of her life, a burden she had not chosen and could not set down. The terrorist organization 17N, which had killed Welch, continued operating in Greece for more than 2 decades after his assassination, carrying out dozens of attacks that killed 23 people, including American, British, Greek, and Turkish officials and business people. The organization remained undetected by Greek authorities, despite intensive investigations, becoming one of Europe's most successful terrorist groups in terms of operational longevity and security. 17N's immunity ended in 2002 when a bombing attack went wrong and injured one of the group's members, leading to his arrest. Under interrogation, he provided information that led to the arrest of other 17N members and the eventual dismantling of the organization. Trials in 2003 resulted in convictions for multiple members, including for the assassination of Richard Welch. The man convicted of being the primary shooter in Welch's murder was Dimitris Koufodinas, who in 2002 was a 45-year-old beekeeper living in a rural area outside Athens. He had been 19 years old in 1975 when he participated in the assassination. According to testimony during the trial, Koufodinas and another 17N member had conducted surveillance to learn Welch's routines and schedule, then waited near the residence entrance. When Welch stepped from his car, Koufodinas fired 3 shots at close range. Koufodinas was convicted of murder and multiple other crimes related to 17N's operations and was sentenced to life imprisonment, which in Greece meant a minimum of 25 years with possibility of release, after 20 years under certain conditions. During the trial, he acknowledged his role in the assassination but expressed no remorse, maintaining that Welch had been a legitimate target as the representative of American imperialism and as someone responsible for supporting authoritarian regimes. At no point during the trial or in subsequent statements did Koufodinas or other 17N members definitively state how they had identified Richard Welch as the CIA station chief or how they had learned his address. Koufodinas indicated that the information had come from multiple sources, and that Welch's position had been well known to those paying attention to American activities in Greece. Whether CounterSpy magazine had been one of those sources, or had confirmed information from other sources, or had played no role at all remained unclear. The CIA's memorial to fallen officers, located at the agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, includes Richard Welch's name among the stars carved into the marble wall, representing officers who died in the line of service. Each year on the anniversary of his death, the agency holds a memorial ceremony that acknowledges his sacrifice and the ongoing risks faced by intelligence officers serving abroad. The broader legacy of Welch's assassination is found in the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, in the enhanced security procedures the CIA implemented for officers under diplomatic cover, and in the ongoing tension between the public's right to know about government activities and the government's responsibility to protect those who serve in dangerous roles. The question of whether CounterSpy magazine bore responsibility for Richard Welch's death cannot be answered with certainty. The magazine published information that was accurate and that confirmed Welch's identity and position. Whether the terrorists who killed him used that information relied on other sources, including the Athens publication, or drew on multiple sources, including the magazine, remains unclear. What is certain is that the magazine created an environment in which CIA officers' identities were treated as appropriate subjects for public disclosure, and that this environment made the protection of those identities more difficult and their exposure more likely. The editors of CounterSpy operated from the belief that exposing CIA activities served important public purposes, that it would constrain what they viewed as dangerous and unaccountable government power, that it would reduce the CIA's ability to support authoritarian regimes and interfere in other countries' affairs, and that it would contribute to a more informed public debate about American foreign policy. They believed these purposes justified the risks they created for individual officers. Richard Welch operated from a different set of beliefs, that collecting intelligence was necessary for national security, that defending American interests abroad sometimes required activities that could not be conducted openly, and that serving in such roles, despite their risks and moral ambiguities, was a form of public service. He accepted the risks of such work, though whether he fully anticipated that his identity would be publicly disclosed and that such disclosure would lead to his death is impossible to know. The terrorists from 17N who killed Welch operated from still different beliefs, that violence against representatives of American power was justified as resistance to imperialism, that targeting CIA officers was legitimate revolutionary action, and that individual lives could be sacrificed in service of larger political goals. All of these people acted according to their convictions, and all of them contributed to an outcome in which a 46-year-old man was shot to death in front of his wife on a December evening 4 months into a new assignment in a country he had studied and worked in for years. The conditions that created this outcome involved intelligence agencies conducting clandestine operations using officers under diplomatic cover, terrorist organizations viewing violence against government officials as legitimate political action, activists and journalists considering the exposure of secret government activities to be a form of public service, and legal protections for freedom of speech and freedom of the press existing in tension with national security imperatives. Each element had its logic and its justifications. The CIA's use of diplomatic cover for intelligence officers reflected the reality that intelligence collection often required operating abroad under official protection. The terrorists' decision to target CIA officers reflected their ideology of anti-imperialism and revolutionary violence. The magazine's decision to publish officers' identities reflected its commitment to transparency and its opposition to secret government activities. The legal framework that protected such publication reflected constitutional commitments to freedom of expression. But when these elements interacted, when the magazine published, when the terrorists targeted, when the officer stepped from his car, the result was Catherine Welch screaming on a driveway while her husband bled to death from 3 bullet wounds to the chest. Richard Welch was 46 years old when he stepped out of a car on a December evening in Athens. Catherine Welch was 44 when she became a widow in the time it took to fire 3 shots. The magazine editors who published his name continued their work for 8 more years without acknowledging any connection between their words and his death. The terrorists who killed him operated for 27 more years before being caught, and between the moment the bullet struck and the moment the killers were finally convicted, Catherine lived with the memory of her husband's collapse, the sound of gunshots she would never stop hearing, and the question of whether words on a page in a Washington office had traveled across an ocean to put a gun in someone's hand. The Intelligence Identities Protection Act that emerged from his death represented an attempt to prevent words from becoming weapons, to draw a line between legitimate journalism and reckless exposure, between the public's right to know and an individual's right not to be hunted. Whether it succeeded depends on what you believe about the relationship between information and violence, between speech and consequences, between the principles we claim to uphold and the prices we are willing to let others pay for them. What is certain is that a 46-year-old man who studied ancient Greek and believed in public service died on a driveway because multiple systems, intelligence work, political activism, revolutionary violence, and press freedom intersected in a way that turned his name and position into targeting information. Everyone involved could justify their actions. No one could bring him back, and the question of who bore responsibility for creating the conditions in which those 3 shots were fired remains one that different people answer differently, depending on where they stand and what they believe about the costs of secrecy and the consequences of exposure. The magazine article that named him took up less than half a page. The legislation it inspired took 6 years to write, and the man it helped kill was gone in the seconds between stepping from a car and collapsing onto cobblestones, leaving behind a widow who would carry what she had witnessed for the rest of her life, and a debate about words and weapons that would continue long after everyone directly involved had died.